Hi, I'm Ari Redboard.
And I'm Isabella Chase.
Welcome to TRM Talks. TRM Talks is brought to you by TRM Labs, the leading provider of blockchain intelligence and anti-money laundering software.
Back in July, the EU's Market in Crypto Asset Regulation, or MiCA, entered into force, initiating the next stage of policy development and preparedness for supervision of the EU's crypto asset sector. Two agencies are responsible for most of this policy development work: the European Banking Authority, or EBA, and the European Securities and Markets Authority, or ESMA, to take us through the EBA's priorities over the next year and how this will impact European crypto businesses and competent national authorities. We're joined by none other than Elisabeth Noble, Senior Policy Expert at the EBA.
Elisabeth, thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining us. I think, as I was saying, as we were ticking down seconds before starting, when we first met a few years ago, I was excited to have you on, and I'm glad it's finally happening today. And MiCA is just such an extraordinary moment, and sort of what's now happening in these next stages towards implementation is arguably the most exciting. So thank you so much for taking the time today.
It's my pleasure. So, Ari, Isabella, thank you so much for the invitation. I always enjoy the TRM Talk series, so it's really nice to be able to participate today and talk a bit about the EBA's work.
Well, that means so much. So to that end, would love to kind of kick things off here. Really sort of would love to hear about your journey into this space, into technology and cryptocurrencies, digital assets. Why don't we start there?
Well, I'm aware that you have a global footprint and most probably listeners from many different jurisdictions, including jurisdictions outside the EU. So I'll start with a couple of words about who we are, and then talk a little bit about what we do in the crypto sector. So who are we? Well, we're an EU agency established back in 2011 as part of the European System for Financial Supervision. Now, our core mandate relates to banking and payments, and our core role is to develop and contribute towards the single rule book, so the set of regulatory measures that applies to the banking and payment sectors in the EU, to promote supervisory convergence, and also to essentially monitor the application of the EU regulatory perimeter. So if we see new or innovative products and services emerging, one of our roles is to essentially advise the European Commission on the potential need for perimeter extensions and new European laws. Now, on crypto assets specifically, this is something that we've been looking at since about 2013. So at that time, of course, most people were typically talking about the so-called virtual currencies, and our attention was very much on two aspects: consumer protection and mitigating risks of money laundering and terrorist financing. So around about 2013, we issued our first warning to consumers about the risks of accessing some of these products, but we also started preparing advice for the Commission on the need to extend the scope of the European Union's anti-money laundering law. So we call that AMLD, the Anti-Money Laundering Directive. And we recommended that crypto to fiat exchanges and wallet providers were already brought in scope, and that did result in some legislative changes. But of course, since then, we've seen a really big proliferation in the use cases for crypto assets. So in 2019, we built on our original advice, essentially recognizing that the majority of crypto assets fell outside the scope of EU regulation, namely they were not financial instruments in the scope of the Markets in Financial Instruments Directive, nor were they considered to be tokenized deposits. And so we said to the Commission, well, this is something that we think could justify a perimeter extension because of risks, including to consumers, including with regards to money laundering issues, but also with regards to some of the lost opportunities. So seeing this use case proliferation, seeing some of the potential there, we thought there could be benefits in having essentially consistent framework for regulation in the EU to cover those crypto assets that were not already in scope of the European framework. And of course, that was one of the contributing advisory measures that fed into the MiCA proposal, and along with a lot of the work that our sister agency, ESMA, prepared around the same time.
So yeah, you really were so instrumental in establishing MiCA, and as of the 30th of June this year, we've had that now entering into the official journal. And as we said at the top, we're now entering into that thorny area of implementation, the EBA being one of the main agencies for that. As we also said, and you remarked to your sister agency, there's quite a nice split now in that implementation phase between the work of the EBA and the work of ESMA. What parts of MiCA is the EBA specifically responsible for?
So I think you're familiar with the broad pillars of MiCA, which cover issuance activities and crypto asset service provision. So on the EBA side, we're primarily responsible for aspects of regulation and supervision of some types of issuance activity. And ESMA, on the other hand, is responsible for policy measures relating to the CASPs and to the issuance of other types of crypto assets that are not within the EBA's scope. So concretely, under MiCA, we are responsible for developing what we call level 2 and level 3 measures as regards two different types of tokens. And what are those tokens? They are so-called asset reference tokens and e-money tokens, so in colloquial terms, stable coins. We're responsible for building those regulatory measures under MiCA to further prescribe the requirements that will have to sit on issuers of those types of tokens. And for the biggest asset referenced and e-money tokens, EBA will be directly responsible for supervising those issuance activities. So those are our first supervisory responsibilities under the European framework.
Fantastic. Would love to sort of dig into that a little bit more in terms of sort of what has been done to date, and then sort of what you anticipate doing over the course of the next 12 months or so, particularly around consultations. If you can talk a little bit about sort of what you've put out there and then sort of what comes next potentially.
Yeah, so just assigned to the EBA, we have about 17 technical standards and guidelines mandates. And then we have another 3, which are either joint with ESMA or joint with both of our 2 sister agencies. So far, we have published 3 consultations, and these deal with the information that needs to be included in an application for authorization to issue asset reference tokens. Another deals with the review of so-called qualifying holdings, so significant holdings in issuers of those types of tokens, looking at aspects such as reputation, financial soundness, risks of money laundering, and then also on complaints handling procedures to make sure that issuers have in place appropriate arrangements to deal with any complaints from token holders. So those consultation papers are out there. And we have upcoming in September a public hearing, and then the consultation phase will end around mid-October. And that shows that for all of our mandates, we will be having 3 months consultation so that we can ensure that industry has a sufficient opportunity to really comment on these new types of regulatory measures. But of course, that's just a small number of our consultations.
It's absolutely extraordinary. And for folks who are maybe less technical and sort of some of this, some of the back and forth, really what you're doing today is taking sort of the high level language in MiCA and explaining to what will be licensed CASPs what they're going to have to do technically to comply in terms of the licensing process. And that's in the form of consultations, right? That's the conversation that you're having essentially. What are you looking to hear back as part of that conversation?
Yeah, so for us, we're really looking to hear industry reflections on whether what we're putting in place is logical by reference to emerging business models, by reference to technologies that may be deployed, and by reference to essentially our regulatory norms around proportionality and so on, to make sure that we're calibrating these things in a way that is fair and sensible and takes into account business models that are just really on the cusp of emerging into market. So I think that's the biggest challenge we have, which is really this sort of calibration of what's there and this further specification of the level 1. So MiCA itself, and then, as I say, we call this level 2 and level 3. On the EBA side, we're really concerned with the measures relating to issuance activity of the so-called stablecoins. ESMA, they are promulgating different consultations on the requirements for the CASPs, but both we and ESMA work very closely together because we're very much aware that some industry participants will be both issuers and crypto asset service providers. So we need to make sure these requirements dovetail really well together. And so again, from an industry perspective, we're really keen to get that early engagement to make sure that what we're putting out there makes sense from a business model perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's that really unique nature of different crypto businesses, as you've alluded to there, that makes both your job really exciting, but also potentially challenging, but really underscores that need for dialogue between the sectors. So just examining one of those sort of technical implementation challenges that we've certainly been thinking lots about is points around that, MiCA is such an all-encompassing set of regulations and is being applied to businesses that, for the majority of the history of crypto, are inherently global and exist both within but outside the European Union. What are the sort of thinking? What's the thinking going on in the EBA at the moment for issuers who want to maintain a sort of EU MiCA compliant business within their wider global practice? I've been thinking, for example, just this week, such a big news for stablecoins with the announcement of PayPal's new stablecoin. How will businesses like that be thinking about, well, I need to have my EU MiCA compliant element, but also maybe I don't want to apply that standard worldwide?
I mean, I think it's a really interesting question, and I think it goes to whether or not the product or service is looking to be positioned towards EU-based customers. If it is, or if you're looking to admit a token to trading on an EU-based exchange, then you need to be looking at those MiCA criteria to think, do I need to be authorized, and what do I need to do in order to be authorized? So, for instance, if you want to issue an asset referenced or e-money token, you have to have an establishment in the EU. You have to have the relevant license either as a credit institution, so as a bank, or as an authorized issuer. But I think MiCA offers opportunities because, yes, there is an authorization requirement. And yes, of course, there are regulatory requirements that attach to that. But I think you can use that almost as your model for then doing business globally, to say, well, this is how we're demonstrating compliance. These are good, I think, at least good requirements around prudential resilience, around sound governance, around treating customers fairly and mitigating conflicts of interest, and of course, managing money laundering risk. So you can almost use it as a template for your global business.
Just a really more point. I promise I won't ask this as a question, but what an interesting moment. I mean, we're talking today in a week in which PayPal has obviously announced a stablecoin, a company with 430 million active users globally. And I look back at 2019 when Libra announced that they were going to issue a stablecoin with that reach globally, and it caused regulators all over the world, including in Europe, policymakers, to think about how do we regulate this space, and years later we end up with MiCA. So I feel like just such an extraordinary moment again to be having this conversation, and so many lessons learned since 2018, 2019 when we really started these conversations in earnest.
Yeah, and I think we've also seen a big advancement in terms of how the industry approaches this as well, because I think with the announcements this week, you can obviously see from the announcements that there is some considerable thinking around the design of the token, around the disclosures, around the reserve arrangements and the redemption arrangements. And I think that sort of maturity shows that the industry, as much as the regulatory and supervisory community, has learnt from those early experiences and is very much cognizant not only of the emerging national frameworks, but also some of the measures emerging at the international level, including from the FSB, around the kind of things you need to be doing if you want to position yourself as a so-called global stablecoin issuer.
Incredibly well said. Yeah, and agreed. It's a
Yeah.
completely different moment.
And we're all looking forward to early September, when we'll have the IMF FSB paper presented to the G20, which will further progress those conversations about global standards. And so we've mentioned PayPal there, but we exist already with loads of different stablecoins already in circulation. Do we have a Wild West for them until June 24, when so-called stablecoin provisions come into force? Or what is the EBA doing now to assist those types of businesses in complying with standards?
Yeah, well, I can only really speak to the EU market in that regard, but to really sort of assist in this 12-month period until the asset reference tokens and the e-money token provisions actually start to apply and to bite in practice, we have issued a public statement which sets out our expectations towards any issuers who come to market within the next 12 months. And that statement sets out essentially 5 grounding principles that we think would lead a compliance by design approach, so that the mindset, so that the compliance systems and controls in place are already there, so that you don't have that sort of sharp adjustment in 12 months from now as you seek to submit your applications for authorization as needed. So those 5 guiding principles run things like governance, risk management, treating customers fairly, having very sound disclosure standards, and of course, early communications with relevant authorities. And I say relevant authorities rather than supervisors, because in these next 12 months, the issuer may not be precisely supervised yet, but they're on essentially a transition to supervision. So why not start engaging early with those relevant supervisors, because they're probably going to be the people considering your authorization request. And again, if you've already shown a strong compliance mindset and shown that attempt to adjust your systems and controls towards MiCA compliance, and I think that can only be good news 12 months from now.
Fantastic. Yeah, no, it's so interesting. I mean, what we're hearing, I mean, you are so busy. EBA is so busy with really all of these consultations and these conversations about what is in MiCA. Let's talk a little bit for a moment about what's not in MiCA and how the EBA is thinking about that, right? We had Peter Kirstens from the European Commission on a month or so ago to really talk about sort of what is in MiCA. And we asked a series of questions on things like DeFi and NFTs and really sort of what comes next here. And that's the nature of technology, right? You get something going and then all of a sudden the technology shifts or changes or evolves. Can you talk a little bit about how the EBA is thinking about, DeFi maybe in particular, but really sort of, what work is to be done in the areas that aren't necessarily covered in MiCA?
Yeah, so Peter and his colleagues were kind enough to set out in MiCA a number of review and reporting provisions, the first of which is due at the end of next year, so relatively soon, requiring us and our sister agency to continue to consider these perimeter questions and of course, ongoing market developments, this being a clear area where things are never static for long. We've seen such an evolution in the crypto markets in the last sort of 10 years or so, and things are moving exponentially now in terms of those use cases and potential for the technology. So we are continuing to look at market developments through the lens of, again, potential for lost opportunity in the absence of a uniform regulatory framework that may cover something that's outside of MiCA. But we're also, of course, continuing to look at risks of money laundering, risks to resilience of the financial sector if some things outside the MiCA scope were to scale or become sort of more integrated within the financial sector. So for us, this means gathering information at the national level, doing our own desk-based analysis and sometimes more academic style research, and then preparing advice and reports for the Commission so that they can take that into account in the context of any review of MiCA, which could, of course, result in a future legislative proposal. So DeFi is one of those areas that we're looking at. Staking and lending, these types of activities are also things that we're looking at, knowing that they are essentially on the rise.
Fantastic. I mean, they really are sort of the more interesting, thorny issues that we are dealing with today, right, in the world. I mean, most regulation policy making has been focused on sort of that more centralized space, and how to license CASPs, how to regulate stablecoin issuers. I think some of those really interesting questions exist today in how we could be thinking about regulation in a truly decentralized world or a more decentralized world, and it'll almost take a different framework in many respects. And it's great to see that there's that there's thinking that's starting around this or has been started around this.
Yeah, and I think it's a thought that needs a sort of collective effort, because as always, if these things are to scale cross-border, and if we're really to see the benefit of some of the economies of scale that come with that, then we need global responses and we need global consistency. So I neglected to mention in the previous answer the fact that, of course, we're engaging at the international level around the FSB table and with colleagues at the FATF and other international organizations also to look at some of these questions. I think the OECD recently published quite an interesting report on the topic of DeFi. And as you say, it may require us to completely rethink the way in which we approach regulation, because those intermediary functions simply may no longer exist. So what other types of regulatory technique can we think of that may allow for greater decentralization, but at the same time mitigate all of those traditional risks that we might see emerging in that space? So it's an incredible challenge, but a really exciting time at which to be really looking at this. So yeah, I'm happy to be.
It's a great way to look at it. And I think Peter was looking at it sort of the same way, like, wow, it is an extraordinary moment to be thinking through these issues. And DeFi is even sort of beyond the thinking that I think we've done so far globally. And there's really not much. You referenced OECD and U.S. Treasury did some risk assessment. There's not a lot out there today. And it's great to hear that there's a lot of thinking happening. Building on that, it's and maybe going back to stablecoins for a moment. There's a great question in the chat, and I could probably give it an answer, but yours will be better. So just from a technical standpoint, when you're thinking about a stablecoin issuer under MiCA, are they required to maintain a separate set of reserves to fulfill sort of the EU requirements beyond what would be required in other jurisdictions?
Well, I think we're in a situation where, although we have FSB standards for so-called global stablecoins, we haven't yet seen the embedding of those standards in many jurisdictions yet in terms of concrete regulatory requirements for so-called stablecoin issuers. So it's a little bit difficult to sort of answer that question in the abstract. But what we can say is, if you are issuing an asset reference token or e-money token within the frame of MiCA, then you do have to have reserves in place. Those reserves need to be ring-fenced in the event of insolvency of the issuer. They need to comply with certain requirements around composition, liquidity, and so on. And so it may be that you have to create some sort of internal partitioning to make sure that you can demonstrate a compliance with those requirements, but doesn't preclude the fact you may have a similar or the same type of token issued in some other jurisdiction.
It seems to me, and Isabel, feel free to jump in here, that is pretty consistent with what we're seeing in other jurisdictions in APAC and Japan in particular, and elsewhere, is those types of requirements. If you want to issue, if you want to engage with people in this jurisdiction, then you're required to maintain those reserve requirements.
No, absolutely. And I think it also speaks to the big data opportunities that we have with this new asset class in terms of what we can observe, to fulfill both those disclosure and liquidity requirements of MiCA, but also when I think more broadly thinking about the different classes within arts and EMTs, thinking about the significance threshold as well, and working through both as regulators and also industry in terms of how do we conceive of significance? Is that ring fenced within the EU, or is it when we consider a global stablecoin as well? And I think that the consultation is a really good opportunity to work through how we think about that, and also how we can best utilize the data available to make those significance-based decisions. On the topic of thinking about all the data, and also to what you were saying earlier about not wanting to lose opportunity when we look at MiCA, we speak so often in these implementation conversations about what this all means for the industry and for different types of service providers. And sometimes we think slightly less about what this means for the supervisors and the regulators themselves. I would love to hear from you what sort of gets you excited really about MiCA. How will the EBA be upskilling to address its new responsibilities under MiCA, and sort of what are the opportunities to drive the quality of supervision in this industry?
Yeah, well, I think you've already said the key word, which is data and monitoring, and how do we really effectively monitor this new industrial sector, in view of the fact that a lot of the distribution channels, a lot of the marketing is done in through sort of non-traditional contexts. So, for instance, we hear social media mentioned a lot as one of the prime ways in which different types of tokens are positioned towards customers. For supervisors, this means that we have really a big learning curve and a really big challenge, because we need to be capable of enforcing the perimeter effectively. And of course, this means that we need to have a better visibility over what's actually there and what's accessible by EU-based consumers. But for that, you need potentially new tools, you need potentially new skills, and you may even need some new staff. So when I look across the 27 member states and what supervisors are starting to do to prepare themselves for applying MiCA in practice, I see quite a lot of attention in those areas. And I think looking for crypto asset data providers in the private sector, and thinking about how some of that data can be combined with new forms of regulatory reporting, that's starting to generate quite an interesting discussion around data use and supervisory applications, which could itself generate new types of tools, such as the so-called RegTech, SubTech type initiatives. For us at the EBA, we have around 12 months to prepare for our own supervision tasks. So one of the steps we took last year, of course, was to procure some third-party data providers to help us in terms of our own visibility over what's happening in the sector. But we're also really extensively engaging in training initiatives with our national supervisors. We're starting to build up our supervisory handbook, our forms, templates, manuals, procedures for engaging with regulated entities, and of course with our system of national supervisors. So there's really a lot going on, and I think it's just so interesting to see how supervisors can themselves work together to generate increased capacity among themselves by knowledge exchange, by data exchange, and starting to sort of sound out different ideas for subtech tools that can allow them to use data better to assist in supervisory activities.
Absolutely. I must say, I was slightly, when I was doing the research for this, I came across the EU Supervisory Digital Finance Academy, which I have to admit I hadn't come across before, but thought that was such a great initiative to, as you say, share those learnings and best practices of how best to conduct technical support across the member states. And just think, I can only imagine how busy that academy is going to be over the next couple of years, but a really excellent initiative.
Yeah, I think so, because I mean, there's a limit to how much new recruiting one can do. And actually, I think a lot of these products and services, they are just so novel there isn't necessarily that sort of depth of experience available within the market that you necessarily need to be capable as a supervisor in this space. I think partly what you need to do is leverage your existing resource and your existing sort of depth of experience around prudential requirements, conduct of business rules, and so on. But then you need to really instill a sort of depth of understanding about how the technology works. And I have to say, I still hear a lot of misconception sometimes around how the technology works, what the different risks are. And I think these types of initiatives, such as the Academy program, are really great in providing a sort of safe space where industry and supervisors can come together to sort of hammer out some of these things and come to a much more clean understanding about what precisely is happening and what precisely the different risks are. And then you can leverage that traditional supervisory experience and hopefully extend that into this newer market.
Terrific. Yeah. Following up a couple of these, and there's some great questions in the Q&A right now. And feel free to say to any of these, hey, we're working on this in the next 12 months. But one that was sort of interesting was around sort of stablecoin issuers. Do you anticipate, really the question is around, do you anticipate having a home country member state as the primary regulator when you're talking about a stablecoin issuer, for example?
Yeah, so if you want to issue an asset reference token or e-money token, then you have to be authorized, and that authorization is done at the national level. So you need to pick a jurisdiction within the 27, submit your application for authorization, and it will be dealt with by the national supervisor. Supervision will only transfer to us at the EU level if the token itself is determined to be significant in accordance with the criteria set out in MiCA. So for the most part, authorization supervision will continue to be done by the national supervisor. And then, yes, you're entirely right to say that in accordance with EU rules, you have a home and a host. So you need to be authorized in one member state. But by virtue of that authorization, you can offer your token in any of the other member states. And similarly, if you're a CASP, you need to be authorized in one member state, and you can provide your wallet services or your exchange services in any of the EU member states.
Which is really the power of MiCA, this sort of idea of a passportable license that allows you to do business really across the entire block. And this really speaks directly to that. You go through the licensing process once, which you'll provide help and guidance on, and then they're able to use that license. Sort of maybe moving out of Europe a bit, but staying on MiCA. How should other jurisdictions be thinking about MiCA, and how do you see it necessarily interacting with global regulatory regime?
Yeah, so I think MiCA is a sort of gold standard at the moment in the sense of it being a rather holistic regime. So I mentioned earlier that MiCA gap fills, so it covers crypto assets that are not already covered by existing in European law. But in terms of its scope of coverage, it's very broad because we are covering essentially all crypto assets but for certain types. And we're not only covering the issuance, but we're also carrying out essentially a regulatory capture of a full range of crypto asset services. So wallet and exchange, but also advising. There's a really long list of different types of crypto asset service. So I think when you look at the scope of MiCA, it can provide other jurisdictions with some inspiration towards both types of activity. And I think it really helps flesh out a little bit some of the concepts that we see set out in some of the international measures in this space. So, for instance, the FSB recommendations, they've been further elaborated this year, but they're rather principles-based around so-called global stablecoins. I think if you look at MiCA, it perhaps provides a bit more flesh on the bone around some of those different types of high-level recommendations. And similarly for the CASP elements, I think you've got quite a complete regime. So I would hope that it can provide useful inspiration. And I hope it would also show that it is possible to set out a set of regulatory rules for this type of business. So I think a few years ago, people were talking about the challenge of dealing with this sector, and it almost seemed like an impossible mission to think about a frame of regulation that you could actually create and attach to these activities. But I think with MiCA, we do show that that is possible. It may take a bit of time, but it's possible, and let's see how it sort of bears out in practice.
Amazing. You're already seeing this? I mean, are you already seeing this play out? Sort of globally, policymakers, regulators are reaching out, wanting to have discussions, and you even maybe see MiCA-esque pieces to regulation that's happening globally.
We certainly have been contacted by quite a lot of third country authorities with questions around particularly reserves and calibration of reserve requirements for the so-called stablecoins. And I think we've seen quite a bit of interest in the so-called crypto conglomerates. So how would these measures attach on a sort of cumulative basis to specific types of firm? And I think that's quite an interesting question, because only in very recent years have we started to discuss and debate different combinations of crypto asset business coming together under the same umbrella. And so now I think that's one of the newer challenges that supervisors and regulators are dealing with, which is, okay, so not just looking at individual business lines, but looking at business lines cumulatively. What do you do with those? And how can you ensure that the governance, the compliance systems and controls, the prudential requirements are right to capture that cumulative business and that cumulative risk?
IOSCO work on especially on that conglomerate point is really interesting, and sort of, again, it's something we haven't seen in traditional finance because regulation hasn't allowed for it. And so I guess, again, to this sort of wider theme in this conversation of what are some of the opportunities, and do we need new frameworks? Is it possible that through lots of concerted effort of thinking together, we can create safe ways for business structures like that to exist? Or, do we need to break them up? It's going to be a really interesting supervisory challenge. And just your point around how is MiCA sitting in the world? I was in Australia a few weeks ago, and I can tell you that there was lots of interest in how the crypto industry, but also regulators within Europe are receiving MiCA and getting ready for it. And as everything ramps up, I would say that yes, the world is watching, and they're keen to see what they can learn from the experience. Just touching back again, though, and to answer one of the questions in the chat, we had a really interesting announcement out of the Federal Reserve yesterday. They released a new program on novel activities, a supervision program for novel activities, which obviously it doesn't go as far as MiCA. MiCA creates frameworks, and also the EU has already had its DLT pilots. Have you had any chance to reflect on the Fed's novel activities for supervision program and how it sort of compares with what the EU is doing?
So I haven't yet done a sort of direct comparison, but I think you can see there's sort of inspiration from types of structures we've seen within the EU, the types of pilots, the sort of sandboxes and so on, where at the national level, we've seen supervisors become almost more accommodative of supporting innovation and experimentation in finance by providing parameters around which firms can test different types of product and service and different types of technology application, both at the front office and also the back office, and both the industry and supervisors to learn essentially in parallel about what types of opportunity does this present, what types of risk does it present, and does it give rise to the need for any sort of recalibration or adjustment to the regulatory and supervisory measures. So I think the Fed initiative is sort of rather similar in terms of the objectives, which is to kind of test and learn. And test and learn is a two-way conversation. And sometimes it might mean that you then have to recalibrate a little bit your regulatory requirements to allow for that potential and to allow for the use of those technologies. But I think it's great to see that these conversations are happening globally. And what I would say with regard to the previous question as well is it's always a two-way conversation. So whenever we're approached by third country authorities, we ourselves are also asking lots of questions. So, what are you seeing in your market? What kind of risk are you seeing? Who's interested? What do your consumers think about this? Are you seeing emerging money laundering risks? The questions are always kind of in both directions. And I think the more we see globally regulators and supervisors engage, the better, because I think crypto assets is probably just the tip of the iceberg. I think when you look at AI and its potential within the financial sector, this is even more transformative. So I think we've got to be ready and we've got to engage early. So I very much welcome the announcements.
I can tell Isabel is ready to follow up, so I'll let her do that. But just a point on that, because I think it is so important. We have had a lot of regulators, policymakers on TRM talks, and the one theme throughout is the nature of this technology, right? Cross-border value transfer at the speed of the internet means that there has to be, there'll never be global, regulation, but consistent standards, across jurisdictions. Because I had a regulator from MAS recently use the term, we're only as strong as our weakest link, just because of the global nature of this technology. And I think you made so many great points around that. It's so important. And I know that regulators are all thinking about what's right in front of them. But I think that we have seen a sort of broader, more global approach because of the nature of the technology.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And this kind of, as strong as our weakest link point, this is so true for any business that has a footprint on an international scale. So we can try and regulate as much as possible, but if we're touching on a market that is global and we still see other parts of that market less regulated or unregulated, of course, issues could emerge there that impact confidence, and that confidence effect can still have a negative impact on the European market, no matter how strong our regulation. So, the more discussion, the more engagement, and the more consistency, the better.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to get it in at some point, and this is like quite a relatively good place to do it. That, of course, you also have another consultation open at the moment, looking at the risk factor guidelines for money laundering, terrorist financing, that brings in CASPs.
How has it been this long?
I know.
In this TRM talks where we have not talked about AML. We're in big trouble.
And that speaks a lot about increased risk from crypto asset activities that's emanating from third countries where you don't have an analogous regime to that is found in the Eurozone. So I think you're also baking in that need for consistency in other parts of your regulatory framework as well.
Yeah, I mean, I'm super happy you picked up on that consultation, which is open until the end of this month. So we'd really encourage your listeners to take a look at that and to offer their feedback. We do quite a lot of work at the EBA on mitigating money laundering risk. The risk factor guidelines is just one example. And this is a set of guidelines that essentially financial institutions need to have regard to, and it helps inform decisions about how to proceed in terms of engaging with new customers, processing transactions, and so on. So these are indicative in the sense of, it doesn't mean that you can't have a specific business line or engage with a specific person, but it gives features to look out for to say that this could imply an elevated money laundering risk. You need to be able to mitigate that effectively in line with the risk appetite of the institution concerned, and in line, of course, with good practices in this regard. So we have, in this edition, proposed a number of extensions specifically on the CASP side, because we see an increased presence in terms of CASP activities within the European Union. But we also see an increase cross-border presence, whether it's inflows or outflows involving CASPs based in in our words, third country jurisdictions. So to promote consistency, to promote higher standards within the industry, we are proposing some extensions to the risk factor guidelines. And as I say, we really welcome feedback on that to say, is this practical? Are we picking up the right types of things? Are we perhaps framing things in the right way or grouping things in the right way? So I think it's one of those things that's really worth having a look at. And it's just the first in a long series of stepping stones as we seek to strengthen the EU's anti-money laundering framework. And of course, you're aware of the really big discussions at the moment on the big draft package of reforms to our AML framework, which would bring in further extensions to the AML perimeter in the EU, but it would also involve the establishment of a new anti-money laundering agency. So that's a very live and active area for political discussion.
Yes, and another area in which having cross-supervisory conversations about the most important institutions can only be a good thing and lead to best practice sharing. We're all very excited about it. And especially the announcement at some point in this year of the location of AMLA when it is finally announced.
If it's announced this year.
Well, we can only hope and to know where we'll all be traveling to over the next couple of years. Elisabeth, taking it back to, I guess we've spoken about how everything's getting really global. Like it's such a global conversation in crypto, but also so much of MiCA is about helping the EU's payment landscape evolve in a secure way. But the way in which the EU's payment landscape has changed since initial conversations of MiCA back in 2019 is so dramatic. You know, we've seen such a growth in fintech. Earlier this summer, we had the single currency package and also the financial access package, which has PSD3 in it. And when we have we might have an EU a digital euro. How will asset classes like arts and EMTs fit within this wider landscape of payments in Europe, and what's that all going to look like?
Yeah, so you're right to flag that at the end of June, the Commission published their proposal, so legislative proposal for the framework for the digital euro. But that is a proposal that needs to be discussed between the European Parliament and the Council. So it still has a way to go until it's eventually, hopefully, adopted and enters into force. And then, of course, after that, it's for the ECB to continue to progress their investigation and experimentation work with the digital euro before ultimately deciding, and this is their sole prerogative, whether to issue a digital euro, and if so, for what purposes and subject to whichever conditions they see fit. So for me, taking into account the time frame and also the different elements that may feed into the design choices for a digital euro, we're probably in a situation where we will see a coexistence between publicly and privately issued tokens for some time. And I would expect to see this globally as well as within the European market. I think for particularly e-money tokens, we will probably see quite an emergence of those within the next few years. I think some will be positioned more towards retail-based use, for instance, on digital platforms, digital marketplaces, and so on, or maybe for cross-border payments and remittances. But we might also see some others that are positioned more for wholesale use. And I think that becomes quite interesting because you're aware that, for instance, in the context of the design for the digital euro, people are talking about perhaps holding limits. They're perhaps excluding the notion of programmability and so on. So perhaps there are also use cases still for privately issued tokens in the form of e-money tokens or asset reference tokens to have some features that could make them useful in that wholesale space and therefore continue to coexist with CBDCs. But I think all of these things together can contribute to a really dynamic and really innovative period for payments. And so what we just need to do as a regulatory and supervisory community is ensure that the sort of running rails are in place that ensure that innovation is responsible innovation and not innovation that could give rise to weaknesses in the resilience of our payment systems, or of course any of the other types of risks that we've touched on during this TRM talks. But I'm pretty optimistic, and I was really pleased to see the package brought forward by the European Commission, which I think is quite comprehensive and already sets quite clearly the sort of direction of travel towards a digital euro.
I literally can't think of a better way to sort of wrap up our conversation. I usually ask a question that elicits an answer like that, but really, I think it's really an extraordinary moment. We had a TRM talks that we recorded actually live, which was cool. A few weeks ago in New York City, with former CFTC Commissioner Christian Carlo and others in the space, and it was really exactly what we're talking about here, and that is, we don't live in necessarily a world of binary choices. It's a world in which you can have private stablecoin issuers, CBDC, Bitcoin, right? You can have a world of choices. And I love the way you described that ecosystem. I can't thank you enough for joining us. I really, really hope to have you back as this work continues, so we can sort of update folks and talk a little bit about sort of what expectations are moving forward. But really, really grateful for the conversation. And thank you so much for joining TRM Talks.
And thank you very much for having me. And just for your listeners, if you'd like to see any of our consultations, they're of course all available on the EBA's website. So very many thanks again.
Love that, absolutely. And constantly writing about MiCA and these topics in our weekly roundup. And I would encourage folks to subscribe. The handouts tab has a link to the roundup, our blog, other TRM talks. We're on Apple and Spotify, and just really great questions in the chat today. So thank you so much for those. And thank you for helping us build a safer financial system. Until next time, thanks everybody.